Okay, hello and welcome to our next webinar, Meeting the Goals of the Paris Agreement, brought to you by the Institution of Environmental Sciences. Today's webinar will be presented by Jo House, Reader in Environmental Science and Policy at the University of Bristol. Jo co-leads the Global Environmental Change at Bristol's Cabot Institute for the Environment and is Director of the MSc in Climate Change Science and Policy. In this webinar, Jo is going to present on the latest science on land-climate interactions and land-based mitigation and its implications for policy. As usual, there will be time for Q&A at the end of the webinar, so please do submit any questions that you have or would like to put forward to Jo in the chat box at the bottom left-hand side of the screen that you can see now. These will be included in the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So thank you for your attention and for logging in today, and please stand by because this webinar will be starting shortly.
Hello everyone, many thanks for joining and listening to my talk today, and apologies for those of you who wanted to hear it last week, but I wasn't well, so thanks for bearing with me and logging in today. So today I'd like to talk to you about the role of the land sector in meeting the objectives of the Paris Climate Change Agreements. I've had the fortune to work a lot on the science side of the evidence leading towards Paris through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I've also spent some bit of time working in government, so seeing things from the other point of view. So I've been very lucky in being able to see things from both sides. Today I'm going to talk to you. First of all, I want to lay out for you the land and climate interactions and why the land sector is important to consider in climate mitigation, and that's because it contributes to about a third of total anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases, but also the land is a net sink for about a third of all carbon dioxide emissions. The land sector's been very important in international climate policy and the Paris Agreement, and in the pledges that countries have made under Paris. It counts for about a quarter of pledge mitigation to date. I'm going to show you the pathways to 1.5 and 2 degrees under Paris and how they rely quite heavily on land mitigation and the implications this has for ecosystem services and land competition. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Global Stocktake, which is what will happen under the Paris Agreement to ensure that we're on target for our global goals. And issues around that between, for example, how we monitor, report and verify what goes on in the land sector, about uncertainties in the land sector, and large differences as well between what countries are reporting under their obligations under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change versus what the global science models find in terms of the emissions from the land sector. And that's quite a significant difference. But we think we've got a handle on why and how we can move forward. So I'll finish off with how we can move forward to improve what's going on in terms of methods, transparency and better governance of what might happen in the land sector to avoid trade-offs and promote synergies. So I've just mentioned the IPCC a couple of times, and I have been involved in IPCC reports, and there's a few coming out that might be of interest and relevance. So the IPCC produces their large assessments every few years, as I'm sure all of you will know. The sixth assessment report cycle has started, and authors have been nominated and accepted. The sixth assessment report won't be coming out till 2021. Building on the fifth assessment report that came out in 2013. There's also, at the moment, we're doing some special reports. There's a special report on pathways to 1.5 and impacts 1.5 degrees. I can't show you results from that yet because these are still draft reports. There's a special report on ocean climate change and a special report on climate change and land that I'm involved in. There's also an ongoing process in the IPCC where we have recommended good practice guidance methods for countries to do their reporting of their greenhouse gas sources and sinks within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so that the methodological guidelines are also being updated at the moment. So it's quite a busy time for IPCC authors. Some of that work I'll bring in and some of it I'll point towards. So let me start with thinking about the key role of land for climate change. This is a picture of the carbon dioxide budget, the global carbon dioxide budget produced by the Global Carbon Project. We produce these budgets every year to take a look at where we're at year on year with emissions and sinks of CO2. There's also now a methane budget. It's a very good website, actually. There's maps of emissions, there's lots of downloadable data, maps of emissions and sinks, and lots of information and slide packs that you can use. So I'd recommend you having a look at the Global Carbon Project site. But as far as carbon dioxide goes, fossil fuels and industry are currently responsible for about 88% of anthropogenic emissions. And land use change is responsible for about 12%. And by land use change, what we're talking about in these methods, in the global models that are used to produce these estimates, it's primarily deforestation, but it's actually the net flux of greenhouse gases. So land is constantly a source and a sink for CO2 due to photosynthesis and decomposition. It's also a source and sink due to man's activities. So there's lots of deforestation activities, and I'll show you in a slide in a minute. There's also afforestation, and that has a net effect, and that's the net land use change. CO2 is primarily driven by deforestation, with some small sinks in afforestation and sources and sinks in managed forests, as well as other ecosystems. So of the net sources of greenhouse gas fluxes, about 46% of that remains in the atmosphere and contributes to an increasing concentration of CO2. About 30% of it is taken up by natural processes on the land, a response of ecosystems to increase CO2, which has a fertilization effect on plants, and also to changes in climate. So, for example, longer growing seasons in the northern hemisphere. And then about a quarter of it is taken up by oceans, again through natural responses due to changes in the increasing concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So land is currently, the land use sector is currently a source, as I said, for about 12% net of greenhouse gas fluxes and takes up about 30%. Historically, so since about 1750, the land sector has been responsible for about a third of all CO2 emissions, because land sector used to dominate, and then as some deforestation rates have gone down and fossil fuel emissions have continued to increase, now it's gone down to about 12% contribution. So just to remind you that this is CO2 only for the moment. And there's one more also thing I want to point out to you, the land sink here, which is about this 30% that's taken up by land, is often referred to in different places, and this is where some of the confusion I'll come into later, is how much of that land sink can be considered to be just a natural response, how much of it can be considered to be directly anthropogenic, so caused by man, and how much is it kind of indirect anthropogenic effects because we're causing the CO2 change. Also, the other thing I wanted to say was we know that we can measure the atmospheric growth very accurately. We get to the fossil fuel and industry emissions fairly accurately from statistics on energy use. The ocean sink, again, there's measurements of the partial pressure of CO2 in the ocean and models used to get to the ocean sink with not so much uncertainty. But if you look at the land use change emissions and the land sink, they have quite high uncertainty. The land use change emissions are calculated in this case by global models, and the land sink is calculated either as the residual of all the other terms, so it's often called the residual land sink, or it's calculated directly by models. But I just want you to note that uncertainty before I go forward. So I said this is looking at some of the contribution to that net land use change flux. And you can see here data from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN. We have areas with red on them are where there's been a loss of forest, and areas with green is where there's been a net gain in forest, and they're looking at 2 decades, the 90s and the 2000s. And so you can see how different regions are contributing to that net flux, some through deforestation, but also afforestation in countries like China and India and Europe. So going back to the fact that this graph I showed you is only carbon dioxide emissions, I want to look at all of emissions and how that fits in. So this is data from our IPCC fifth assessment report. And this is showing you the greenhouse gas emissions from 1970 to 2010. The dark orange colour is showing you the CO2 emissions from FOLLOW. There stands for forestry and other land use. So that's essentially similar to the data I showed from the Global Carbon Budget, so CO2 from land use change. There's also other greenhouse gases there, and they're not separated out into the different sources. This figure separates out CO2 emissions from fossil fuel in yellow and the CO2 net flux from the land in orange. But then within the methane and N2O box colours, there's also contribution from other aspects of human use and management of land, particularly from agriculture. So if we look at the entire contribution of anthropogenic land use change and land management, including the non-CO2 gases, this figure shows you what that's been from the 1970s through to 2009. The dark red colour at the bottom is the CO2 from land use change and forestry. Then all the other colours are the non-CO2 contributions, primarily from different aspects of agricultural management. So from manure, from fertiliser use, from emissions from agriculture, from rice, from enteric fermentation of ruminant animals, and from drain peat. What you will notice here is for the dark red, for the land use change and forestry flux, the emissions were going up, but they've actually come down, and this is the only sector where net emissions are declining. The agricultural emissions are still going up and are expected to do so. When you look at all emissions of all greenhouse gases from the whole land sector, including agriculture, then the land sector is responsible for, estimates vary, but it's usually between about a quarter and a third of total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions come from what we do on the land. So this figure's quite a mess. There's a lot of information going on in here. This is actually something I'm preparing for the IPCC special report on climate change and land, so it's still a draft figure. And it's shown different estimates of what the net flux of carbon dioxide from land use change and management is over the period 1990 to 2016. So it's equivalent to the graphs I was showing earlier from the Global Carbon Budget. So if we look for the red lines for a minute, the solid red line is actually the number that's used in the Global Carbon Budget for the net anthropogenic flux from land use change. And that's derived from two types of models called bookkeeping models, which are kind of accounting models where they track land cover change and track the emissions associated with curves of growth and curves of decay to come up with a net annual flux. The very pale lines, of which there's many and they're all over the place, these are all results from process models, from dynamic global vegetation models. So these are model all the processes. They're modelling photosynthesis and respiration, and they're driven with year-to-year variations in the weather, so climate, and also with CO2 and nitrogen deposition. And then they model what the response is, and they also fed with data on historical changes in land cover and land management. And you can see there's a really, really large variety between the models, mostly because they're kind of responding quite differently on year-to-year climate variability. But the mean of the models, shown in the dark blue solid line, is not so far off the mean of the bookkeeping models. In green are estimates of the land flux by the FAO. You can download this from FAO websites. And they show fluxes including and not including a peatland flux. So there's quite a large emissions from burning of peatlands that actually aren't included in the global models. And this is showing those emissions with and without. And the FAO uses kind of the IPCC, I talked about the IPCC guideline methods. They use the tier 1, which is the most basic, most easy to apply methodological approach. The black line is showing what countries have reported to the UNFCCC as their net land flux. And what you'll notice is not only is that quite a lot lower than the global model estimates, but it's also showing quite a strong decline in the net flux. So it's starting off as emissions, and then in the most recent years, it crosses, and I'm sorry that it's come out very blurry in this presentation. So it crosses in about 2010 to become a net sink according to what countries submit. I'm going to come back to this a little bit later because that difference is quite worrying when we come to some of what we need to do under the Paris Climate Change Agreement. So the reasons why there's differences between all these estimates is different sources of data on, for example, land cover change, but also on carbon in the soil and in biomass carbon. It's because they all include different processes. Some include forest management, some not. Some have a nitrogen cycle. Some think about harvested wood products, some don't. They're all using really different methods. And that's because actually many of them were developed for quite different purposes. So the purpose of a global model and what they're looking at is quite different from the purposes of country reporting and accounting. And there's also issues around how you do this attribution to what is anthropogenic as opposed to natural. And again, I'll come back to that later. So, land sector and international policy. There's been a lot of difficulties with getting the land sector included in international policy, and that's partly due to this uncertainty we've just shown you. So, for example, when the Paris Agreement entered into force, for it to enter into force, the number of countries that signed up had to be equivalent to 55% of the emissions covered in 55 countries. And there was a decision about whether to include the land sector in that 55% of emissions. It was decided uncertainties were so high that the 55% would be based just on fossil fuel and industrial emissions. So uncertainty in emissions has been kind of problematic. There's also specific issues around leakage, permanence and additionality. So leakage means you might decide to not cut forest in one place, but if the agricultural production still needs to happen, then it might just result in forests being cut in another place to be replaced with agriculture. So that's leakage. Permanence might be you decide to plant a forest or protect a forest, but what would happen if that forest then became subject to management in the future? Do you give someone credits and then it gets cut down anyway? Or it might be subject to fire or drought, which might have increased risk under climate change. And the other is the problem of additionality. Would the practice that you're going to do have happened anyway? Were you going to reduce your deforestation anyway? Or is this what you're doing? Is it additional? And then more recently, there's been raised a lot of issues around these different trade-offs, competition with land for food and for other ecosystem services, how this might affect land rights, how it might affect climate justice. So LULUCF is UNFCCC speak for the land sector. It's land use change and forestry. And countries are expected to report their sources and sinks of CO2 under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Just let me flick through for a minute. I'm just going to take a step back and think about what the UNFCCC is. It was a treaty that came out of the Rio Earth Summit. It was heavily informed by the science. The IPCC was established before then by the World Meteorological Organization and UNEP, and provided the science base that highlighted the needs to have an objective to achieve stabilisation of greenhouse gas at a level preventing dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. It committed countries to reporting their greenhouse gas fluxes in their inventories, which is some of the data I've been showing you. But through the reporting, but also with targets, there was a system of differentiated commitments. So developed countries, known as Annex 1 countries, adopted actual targets of what they should do to return greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels with respect to particular targets like 5% reduction compared to 1990 levels. Developing countries didn't have hard targets, but they were expected to implement programs and measures. They also weren't expected to achieve such high levels of reporting as Annex 1 countries. So Annex 1 countries typically report annually and they have to use higher methods. Developing countries don't tend to report very often and they tend to use more simple methods. So all countries should report anthropogenic emissions and removals of greenhouse gases from changes in carbon stocks in living and dead organic matter and soil carbon. They report in changes from forest land to cropland, to grassland, wetland, settlements and other land. So what happens when you change from one land type to each other. And then they also report on changes due to management within a land type. So for example, forest management. The Kyoto Protocol was adopted in 1997. It came into force in 2005 and it stays in force till 2020. So even though the Paris Agreement's been signed, the Kyoto Protocol is still in force. That sets very specific targets for Annex 1 countries. It was ratified by 192 countries, but USA signed but not ratified. Canada's pulled out. The EU's got a target of an 8% reduction. Well, that's an example. And the UK actually, within the EU basket, we have higher reduction commitments. And within under the Kyoto Protocol, that the reported information from countries becomes accounted towards meeting their targets. And the land sector can be used towards meeting targets, but the target reduction relates to energy and industry, but you can use your LULUCF accounting towards meeting those targets. And then countries account for the impacts of afforestation, reforestation, deforestation and forest management. And they can voluntarily report and account for the effects of grazing land management, wetland drainage and rewetting. And there are also within that methods to factor out the impacts of natural disturbance like fires and insects and to account for harvested wood product. Also, there was a clean development mechanism where developed countries could have projects in developing countries and then count those towards their targets. There's also separate from the Kyoto Protocol, there's the RED Plus program, the reduced emissions from deforestation, degradation, and that's a separate UN program, but that has projects that protect forests in developing countries. So that was where we're at, and we have the Paris Climate Agreement, which was signed in 2015 by 198 countries, have now approved it, and it's entered into force. Some things to pick out from that are very relevant to the land sector. Of course, there's the 2 degrees target and the aspiration for a 1.5 degrees target. There's also under emissions objectives aim to reach a balance between emissions from human activity and the amount that we captured sinks. And at the moment, the only way we need to do sinks is in the land sector. It's by afforestation and enhancing soil carbon stocks and things like that. So the land sector is really key towards sinks, and there was a very strong recognition of sinks and the role of agriculture and also the role of RED Plus, reduced emissions from deforestation. Under the review mechanism, there's an aim to have a review every 5 years starting in 2023, and that's called the Global Stocktake. And that's meant to assess our collective progress towards meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. So embedded within this, there is suddenly a need for very credible and transparent reporting of greenhouse gas fluxes. So let's have a look for a minute at the pathways to 1.5 and 2 degrees. So Article 4 of the Paris Agreement was about the longer-term goal of 2 degrees, and this shows a whole lot of scenarios from integrated assessment models. It's got historic emissions going into the future. The RCP are the different representative concentration profiles that end up with a different radiative forcing equivalent to the temperature that's shown. So, for example, if we look down to the bottom, to the blue one, is RCP 2.6 would end up with a temperature change in 2100 of between 0.9 and 2.3 degrees C globally. And what you might notice about that is it crosses the line into net negative global emissions. So, in other words, it means net sinks of greenhouse gases, because this is a CO2 equivalent for a greenhouse gas. So it means net sinks for greenhouse gases to achieve with a 60% likelihood of achieving a 2 degrees target. So net negative emissions means we need sinks. We need a way of sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. If you look in this graph, this is showing you the carbon emissions, the human carbon emissions going forward in scenarios and where they need to get to by 2100 for a 2 degrees target. So you have emissions there in grey from fossil fuel and industry, and black are the emissions from land use change. And those black emissions from land use change are turning in around 2050 to a net sink from land use change there in the orange. So the land sector is expected to go from a source to a sink. Then there's also assumptions about additional human sinks. So through, and they're thought to be from biomass energy with carbon capture and storage very strongly. In this diagram, treated as separate from the land sector sinks, which are mostly about afforestation and reforestation. Then you've still got the biosphere carbon sinks. That's a natural response to the biosphere, the kind of residual flux that I was showing earlier, and you've got the natural response of the ocean. So that's a lot of sinks that the land sector is expected to meet when you add up the afforestation and bioenergy carbon capture and storage in order to get to 2 degree scenarios. So this is just a list of different kinds of options. We've already mentioned afforestation and RED and forest management. There's all kinds of forms of agricultural management, dietary change, fertilizer management, waste reduction, and also here's bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, where you're growing trees that take the CO2 out of the atmosphere, you're burning them to produce energy, which reduces emissions in the fossil fuel sector. But then the carbon capture and storage part of that is that you then take the residue and bury it underground, and you capture CO2 from the waste pipe of burning and then pump that deep underground. And so rather than the CO2 just being released back to the atmosphere when you burn it, you're capturing it and then burying it. And so that's a strong negative emission, it's a strong sink. There's been a wealth of literature coming out now. It's quite overwhelming doing the special report on climate change and land because there's so much literature coming out, but it's fantastic. Many people doing studies on how the land sector can contribute to emissions reduction and also what the implications of that are. So this is just one particular example. The figure over to the left is showing you where the land sector mitigation fits within all needed mitigation. And the pie chart in the middle is showing you where some of that mitigation might come from in the land sector, with quite a chunk from reduced deforestation and degradation. You've got agriculture in there, shift to plant-based diets, reducing food waste, various other. And within agriculture, you've got a reduction in livestock emissions, crop and pasture emissions, rice cultivation, synthetic fertilizer production. So there's quite a lot of potential in land. This is just one result. Here's another paper by Griscom et al. That looked at natural solutions. So it just didn't include BECCS in this. And you can see that there's different estimates from, for example, forests, showing you a kind of minimum and maximum that you might achieve from forests. with also on the left in those little colours are showing you other benefits. So does this benefit biodiversity? So for example, reforestation could benefit biodiversity. It could also have a benefit for soil and water. And that, if you goes down the list, you've got various options in forestry. You've got biochar, so that you burn to make charcoal and then you bury that. And that's taking CO2 out because the biochar breaks down very slowly. Various agricultural practices and wetland restoration, coastal restoration, peat restoration. And there's also been a lot of studies of the impact of this, and these are a couple of studies by Pete Smith and co. That came out in Nature Climate Change in 2016. There's two separate papers. And the study on the left with the purple and the green bars is looking at the implications of different options to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So it's got BECCS, biomass energy, carbon capture and storage from growing crops. In purple, in the greens, it's got forestry options, both forestry BECCS, so where you're using wood for BECCS, and afforestation and reforestation. And then it's got other carbon dioxide removal technologies, so direct air capture and enhanced weather in the more technological side of things. And that's showing you the implications for land. So unsurprisingly, crops, bioenergy and forest bioenergy have large implications for land requirements. They also need a lot of water. The crop side of things tend to be more fertilized, so they have implications for nutrient use. And they will have implications for energy use. And then the costs are down the bottom there. So you see that actually the crop and forest BECCS only costs are shown there, and they're quite high. The costs for afforestation are much lower, and you see that in another slide. And on the right, this is the implications for particularly biochar and soil carbon enhancement. And again, another paper, again, there's so many papers coming out on this. This is a very recent one that's come out that looks at comparing different greenhouse gas removal options, doing a systematic review. So it's looking at the technological readiness, the side effects, whether the issues around permanence and the cost. So if you have a look at the graph in the middle, it's showing the cost versus the carbon dioxide removal potential. And you've got afforestation, reforestation there in green, so relatively low cost, and some carbon removal potential up to about 3 gigatons of CO2 per year. You've got soil sequestration there, also still low cost, maybe slightly higher potential. You've got bioenergy in the orange in the middle, a lot higher cost. And again, potential is variable. And then it also looks at the side effects. And this is where a lot of literature is coming out at the moment that we're going to be assessing in the special report on climate change and land. So there are benefits and there are trade-offs, and it's about getting the balance right and in terms of having a basket of different options available. And this sort of information is really helpful in terms of informing that kind of decision making. So let's just have a look at the moment at the contribution of the land sector, the LULUCF sector, land use, trade and forestry, to mitigation pledges under the Paris Agreement, which are known as nationally determined contributions of the different countries. So countries made their pledges about what they would do, and they included some of them just general targets, some quite specific targets on both fossil fuel reduction and land sector reduction. The figure is showing you the historical emissions as reported by countries to UNFCCC, and that's the black line there. And you've got going into the future from 2010, these are the pledges. The blue line is showing you what countries have said their business as usual pledges are. Now you might wonder why historically it's been going down, but the business as usual pledge goes up. And I'm just going to flip forward and show you this for Brazil. So this is what's going on in Brazil historically. The brown bars are the deforestation rates historically. So deforestation was going up and then it started coming down. Brazil Decree 7390 required it was a law put in place for 80% reduction in emissions, in rates of deforestation, below what was the 1995 to 2006 average by 2020. And so the dash blue line, the dash brown line is showing you that average, historical average, and the green line is showing you what would be required to get to 80% reduction by 2020. And so the question becomes, what is Brazil's business as usual? Brazil's implemented the law, so should business as usual be how they're reducing? Should business as usual be that historical mean, or should business as usual be the fact that, in fact, they were going up? And for Brazil, their business as usual is the fact that deforestation rates are increasing. Then they've done something about it. So business as usual is increasing. Now they've done something about it. That's what they should be credited for. So that's why business as usual looks like it's going up. It is going up. The pre-INDC is actually where we'll be going forward with current policies in place. So, for example, that would be including the Brazil policy that's already in place. Then the green and the black lines are what countries have committed under their NDCs, with the black line being this is unconditional, this is what they'll promise to do anyway, and the green line is conditional on funding. And so from this we see that the land sector, when we look across all sector contributions, could contribute about a quarter of emissions reduction, most of which comes from afforestation, but a small percentage comes from forest management. However, the way that might be tracked, for example, if you compared that reduction in 2030 to where we were at in 2005, it's a 1.2 to 1.9 gigaton of CO2 emission reduction. If you compare it to current activity, then it's a little bit more. If you compare it to what countries' business as usual is, then that's an awful lot more. And then if you do the crediting the way the countries do their accounting methods themselves, then it's even more. So it's important to be really transparent actually about what is the emissions reduction, because what the atmosphere sees is where we're at in 2030 compared to 2010. But actually what countries may get credited for is more than that. So this is a big discussion that needs to happen under the negotiations. So where do the NDCs take us? This is from the UNEP GAP report that looks at pledges and where we're getting to every year. You've got the baseline in brown, in grey at the top, the current trajectory of where we're expected to go, and then you've got where the NDCs take us, the unconditional and the conditional country pledges, where they take us to. Then in blue, you've got where we need to be for 2 degrees. So you can see even with the pledges already in place, we've still got quite a gap that we need to fill to remain within 2 degrees. So the pledges currently take us to about 3 degrees. So there's more action we need to take. The other I've talked about the Global Stocktake. So there's an enhanced transparency framework discussion that's going on at the moment about how to track countries' progress towards their individual targets in their NDCs. But there's also this Global Stocktake that will start in 2023 that should highlight the collective progress towards meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, including looking at this gap. And the idea of that is we see where we're getting to, and it's a way, an engine to increase ambition under the Paris Agreement. So that Global Stocktake will very likely, it's all up for negotiation, compare the country data, these greenhouse gas inventories reported under the United Nations Framework Convention, to the science-based 2 degrees trajectory, so what the global models show us. And so the gap that you might have noticed before becomes quite a big issue, because these things need to be comparable, because we need to be ensured that the targets and the progress towards them are credible and that everything's transparent. And so just picking out that gap for a minute there, here's one of the bookkeeping models in green, the Houghton bookkeeper model, and there's the country reporting, just pulled out from that big messy diagram before, and there's a 3 degrees gap. So we've been doing some work on why that gap is there, and a lot of it actually is due to how you deal with what is anthropogenic and what's not. So if you break down human actions on the land, you have these direct human effects where you're changing land cover, deforestation, afforestation, or you're doing harvest, and that's very clearly anthropogenic. Down the bottom, you've got natural effects. So, for example, the impacts of natural disturbances like fire and year-to-year climate variability. And that's, really natural, considered very natural. And you've got this in-between response of the land to CO2 and climate change, which are treated as indirect human effects. And there's quite a big difference between the models and the country reporting and how they deal with those. So the direct effects can be considered, you're doing something directly to the land, it's clearly managed land. These indirect feedbacks, these CO2 and climate change, happen both in managed land and in unmanaged land, as do the natural effects. The approach taken in the models is that they only model these direct human effects as anthropogenic, and they deal with all the indirect and natural effects as being non-anthropogenic response of the land, this residual sink. The countries take a different approach, which is a pragmatic approach in reporting, where they separate land into managed land and unmanaged land, and they look at the change in carbon stocks in everything they consider managed land. And so for extant forests that they consider to be managed, they're capturing these sink effects due to the CO2 and climate, where the models aren't capturing those effects. So for example, many European countries consider that all their forests are managed. There's no such thing as unmanaged forests. So where those forests are responding to CO2 and climate and therefore they're increasing their carbon sinks, that's captured under the managed land proxy, it's known as anthropogenic effects. And so they're capturing a big sink that isn't being captured in the models. And we've done some analysis to look at that. We've compared the bookkeeping models with the DGVMs to what's in the inventories. And we showed in the figure at the bottom, we've got the bookkeeping models in blue that are just really doing land cover change, not land management effects. Then we've got the impacts of climate and CO2 from different models from the DGVMs, this kind of indirect effect. And when you add both of those together, the blue and the orange, then you get what's in the grey bar. And that's much more similar then to what's in the inventories from countries. So although there's a big difference, we think we've got a handle on where it's coming from. It's primarily in managed forests, and it's primarily in developed countries. So we've got large areas of managed forests. So what's the implication of this for the 2 degrees trajectory? It doesn't really impact the trajectory of where we need to go. It just really changes what you're considering as the land use change emissions and the residual sink. So it needs a little bit of thinking when you do that comparison about, are we actually comparing like for like? So finally, the implications and the way forward. So first thing we need to do is on the IPCC's methodological guidance side, as we're updating our methods, we're asking countries to further clarify what they're including in their greenhouse gas inventories and to give more transparent information. From the science side, we're also looking at how we can break down the model results and how we can do more specific model experiments that really get you towards the sort of information that's within the inventory, so they can be more comparable with particular special model runs and model experiments that then fit more towards the countries are doing. What's really good news is there's a lot of ongoing improvements in data, especially all the information available from satellites in terms of land cover change, land biomass, and better understanding and better data that will help us improve both on the country inventory side and on the global modelling side. And it would be helpful as well in order, again, to make more comparable, so there's some kind of monitoring of what the fluxes on unmanaged lands are and separately from the managed lands, then that would help us have a more complete picture. I think there's a big question with this issue around managed forests. At the moment, managed forests are included on the managed land proxy as being a part of the sink. What will happen when we include REDD+, which is essentially protecting managed forests in developing countries? Will those then be considered managed forests and therefore anthropogenic sink, or will they still be considered natural? I think that's a big issue that will, how that will be dealt with in terms of accounting and crediting will be quite interesting going forward, and we don't know where the negotiations are at with that yet. And so how can we optimise then mitigation on the land sector? So the better quantification of these trade-offs, win-win, synergies, the co-benefits for ecosystem services is really critical, and it's great to see so much literature coming out of that. Generally, reduced deforestation comes out key because it's relatively cheap. It's got many synergies and immediate benefits, such as avoided emissions and reduced biodiversity loss. So that comes out as being a key, immediate, cheap and effective strategy. Afforestation and reforestation also come out relatively cheap and immediate, but there's limited capacity. So what do you do when that forest has grown and mature? And this is maybe when you can start thinking about forest management for wood products, long-lived wood products, and also for bioenergy. Bioenergy in BECCS has got a large potential. The impacts are quite variable depending on the sort of bioenergy. It needs quite careful consideration, but the potential could be huge. But it will need careful consideration and management to avoid large-scale land competition and negative impacts. And how might these be incorporated into policy and behaviour choices? What sort of instruments might be used? Might be sustainability criteria, certification. How might that be included in the Paris Agreement that already talks a lot about sustainability? So these are all issues that the negotiators will be dealing with going forward. But just to say that there is, if we link this to international policy, there are a lot of potential synergies under the UNFCCC, under the Montreal Protocol, under the Convention of Biological Diversity, in dealing with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Sendai Framework on Risk Reduction. So actually now it's about not considering these policies in isolation, but how can we bring them all together and find solutions that are best for climate and the environment. Sometimes in science we talk a lot about uncertainties in detail, and sometimes policymakers want quite simple answers, but actually what's really good at the moment is the level to which scientists and policymakers are now interacting and talking to each other to try and come up with the best solutions. So I'll just leave you with that slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo. That was really interesting and quite a whistle-stop tour. I think there's a whole another avenue that we could explore with future webinars maybe. But there are a couple of questions that have come in, and we have got 10 minutes or so to ask through them, if that's okay.
Yep.
So the first question actually is from Robert Ashcroft, who's our policy officer here at the IES. And he says, is there much variability in the extent to which different countries have considered land-based emissions reductions in their NDCs? And if so, is this reflective of differences in understanding engagement or other factors?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes, it's a huge difference. So, for example, you've got countries like Brazil that included their policy to reduce deforestation to 80%. I think Mexico's got a commitment of reduction in 50%. There's some countries that have pledged to reduce deforestation completely. There's other countries like China and India who've made pledges about increasing afforestation or forest carbon sinks. So some countries have been very ambitious and very specific. Some are less so, and some are non-specific. So some might have a target that just might be we'll reduce our total emissions by a certain percent, or we'll reduce our emissions incentive. And they say they include all sectors, but they don't give specific targets for land or energy. Some countries, there's a great site actually, it's called Climate Action Tracker. If you look on there, that will you can look at each individual country's NDC from the UNFCCC website, but Climate Action Tracker also goes through it, and it looks at their country's NDC and it ranks them about whether they feel they're ambitious or not ambitious. And that's quite a good site to look at for that, because some of them are very ambitious and some not. What I think is really interesting about the Paris process. So Copenhagen was one of the big negotiations. The negotiations happen every year, and the conference parties at Copenhagen was a big failure, and everyone was very disappointed. And that was really taking a kind of top-down approach to targets that was taken under the Kyoto Protocol of giving countries targets and then, trying to make that fair. And that didn't really work. And what was interesting about Paris is it all turned on its head and said, what will you commit? What was really interesting about that actually is it was developing countries that often made the most ambitious pledges, because they're feeling the impacts now, and because they're at a development stage where they're able to, and because they just want to be ambitious. So in fact, instead of it being the developed countries have more money who are more ambitious. It's often been the developing countries. And for those countries, often the predominant source of their anthropogenic emissions is the land sector. So, their emissions from deforestation or from agricultural production or from sheep are much, much higher than their fossil fuel emissions. So some of them have been, yes, very ambitious. Is it reflective of differences in understanding or engagement? Yes, I think so. And other factors. There's many political factors. There's lots of, especially around financing, which is why you've got these different targets based on conditional, unconditional, and often that's conditional on finance and other kinds of support.
That's interesting. So when you say that developing countries are more ambitious, are they also successful in their delivery of the ambitions that they set out?
Yeah, so that's something we don't know yet. The Global Stocktake actually will look at the global progress. It deliberately doesn't look at individual country progress. There is, as there is now with reporting, there's a review mechanism that happens within countries where they'll look at individual country progress and review that. And that's a slightly separate process to the Global Stocktake, but that review will happen. But at the moment, it's early days. The Paris Agreement doesn't even come into effect till 2020. And so those kind of pledges won't really come into effect then. And then they're out to 2030. So it'll be in 2030 that we're kind of really, between now and then, we'll have the Global Stocktake in 2023, and that will hopefully help drive ambition up. But the process of looking at country pledges and individually is probably going to come a little after 2023. There's a lot of sensitivities as well about which data you use, whether you use the reported data or which will be used on the Global Stocktake, or whether you use country accounting, and like I show the controversies about different accounting approaches that might be used.
Okay, that'd be really interesting to see then. Another question that we've got is from quite a different angle from Peter Sanderson. He is talking a bit more about the models. So he asks, the models seem to rely quite heavily upon BECCs for future scenarios, but are there many actual examples of BECCS systems working in reality?
Another very good question. BECCS, they require BECCS at very, very large scale. There's lots of very good and also not so good practice about bioenergy happening. So, for example, in the UK, we import quite a lot of wood fuel pellets to burn in the Drax coal-fired power station. And there are mechanisms that Drax has in place around sustainability and looking at. We import it mostly from America, and they use sustainability criteria to ensure that it's come from sustainably managed forests. Brazil has a massive fuel ethanol program where they use residues from sugarcane production to produce ethanol, and those residues will be wasted otherwise. So there are some very good examples of fairly large scale BECCS, but there's also the risk that BECCS might drive, for example, deforestation for oil palm, although most deforestation for oil palm goes into the food and cosmetics and industry sector. A very tiny amount of oil palm goes towards BECCS. Bioenergy. In terms of BECCS with the carbon capture and storage, the carbon capture and storage technology is still very new. There's only, I think, 3 demonstration plants. It's still very small scale demonstration. There's still a lot, it adds a lot of expense to scrub it out, so it adds to the costs. And there's lots of discussion about, where it could be stored and whether it would stay there. Although, from the geological perspective, at least the fact that deep rock storage, putting it in where oil comes out and it's staying there, there does seem to be good potential there. But it's the kind of technology at large scale, and the cost of that is still very, very early stage. And this is the issue. To reach the 2 degrees goal, we would need to be having BECCS coming online at large scale by about 2040, and that means we need this technology, and we need it to be happening much faster than it is in order to reach those targets.
Wow, okay, so there's quite a lot of pressure if we were to actually use that to get it effective by 2040. Wow, okay. He's also put in another question and asked whether BEIS has started talking about carbon capture, utilization and storage rather than just carbon capture and storage. Have climate models started to model CO2 utilization, or is this focus still on CCS?
Yeah, so another good question. So it's actually the integrated assessment models that deal with this sort of thing, and these and lots of people are quite interested in this carbon capture and utilisation. Usually the utilisation is, it doesn't say necessarily stay stored for a long time, so this is things like pumping it into greenhouses to promote better growth, but then those plants that are being grown in the greenhouse, usually they're decomposed and the CO2 is back in the atmosphere fairly quickly. But generally, no, the integrated assessment models are, these are complex models that are trying to measure lots of different things at the same time. They're trying to measure all the energy system, and they only really deal with a kind of few different key levers. And so BECCS has been quite a key lever. So they're not necessarily doing many of the things, like they're not including some of the soil carbon strategies. They don't include biochar. They don't include wetland drainage and wetting. So there's lots of things at the moment that aren't in those integrated assessment model scenarios. So you could argue they could be even more ambitious, or you could argue actually, on the other hand, they're not very realistic about assumptions made about yields. They usually assume very high yields and lots of fertilizer and lots of irrigation. And that's because the exam questions those models are being used to answer isn't, what's the realistic pathway. They're really trying to say, if we force the system to get to 2 degrees, how could we do that? If we were really forcing the system into 2 degrees, how would we get there? And so the only way to get there is by making assumptions about very high agricultural yields that free up land that then can be used for forests, and very high bioenergy yields. And so they get to 2 degrees, and you can do it that way, but it takes quite large assumptions about yields and fertilizer use. So then the other argument is they're being overambitious. So there's all this that needs to be teased out, really.
Yeah, and I assume an accuracy problem in there as well.
Oh yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Well, that's all the questions that have come in, and that's taken us perfectly on to 1:30. So I'm going to have to close the webinar now. But just final thanks to Jo for giving up the time and to speaking about that. So thank you very much, and thanks all for attending.